The topic for the conference, Catastrophe and Crisis as Concepts, is close to my work. But closer is the medium of responsive literature. So I've written this paper out just to make sure that we keep close to time. And I know that we started a bit late, so I would ask either Pritiman or maybe the chair to remind me 5 minutes before 30 is over, so that I can make sure that we rush through certain things, skip over certain things. I congratulate the organizers for thinking of this particular phrase, responsive literature. Responsive, which has the root word respond, and can indicate a cognate word responsible. The speaker before me talked about the question of responsibility. I want to talk about that as well, and broadly the paper and my argument is going to be, what does literature do? What is the role of literature when there is a catastrophic crisis that an author is living daily? Right? So we'll come to that part. Let me start with the question of response, because it got me thinking. Why responsive literature? If we go back, respond etymologically speaking, derived from the Latin prefix re, that is again, and the verb spondere, that is to pledge. From there to the French verb répondre, that is to answer, to the late Middle English word that is respond. Respond thus inheres in it the essential meaning of taking a pledge to stand to something that is understandably wrong. In art, responsibility is the question of commitment to society and readership, of course, but also to aesthetics. Responsive and responsibility are, thus, crucial but challenging words for literature, especially when the literature emanates from the moment of a catastrophe and its resultant social crisis. We have been taught, in literature departments at least, and we know that literature reflects upon society and social life. We started with this, right? That literature is the medium through which a long-term social crisis is given a cognitive totality. That is, we can understand a period's history and crisis through the everyday life and conflicts of a single character or a protagonist. All of literature's rhetorical components have been established with this fact in mind, that literature, and here I broadly mean dramatic, epic and fictional literature, is written to address a national, transnational or local socio-political crisis, a crisis that has taken time to build and recover from, instructing upon us some very crucial questions about life and living. Just to give a few examples, think about the Indian or the Greek epics, Homer's epics, or Indian epics, right? Based on a character and a broad social crisis being reflected upon through the characters. To Shakespeare's Macbeth, Tolstoy's War and Peace, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, or Ashapurna Devi's Protham Pratishruti, or even Bama's Karuppu. You will notice in this varied list of literary works that I have just mentioned that while their genres and thematic treatments may vastly differ from each other, epic, theatre, novel, autobiography, it is possible to establish stylistic equivalence in them. By which I mean, you would remember such terms as dramatic monologue, aside, free indirect discourse, narration and narrative, implied author, intertextuality, episodic narration, etc., are being used interchangeably in these generically different works. But what happens when the literature is about the sudden collapse of society due to a disaster? Shakespeare hardly wrote about his contemporary times, but was clever enough to use contemporary tropes and themes through historical event-based plays such as Macbeth. Who would say that Macbeth or King Lear's teachings are not for contemporary use? The same can be said of War and Peace, প্রথম প্রতিশ্রুতি or ইতিহাস একটি নদীর নাম. Literature written about historical events that are decades or in some cases centuries old and have subsided now into deep-rooted social crisis. But again, how to write literature during the moment of the historical tragedy? I will slightly rephrase the question. What should writers do when a political or an environmental catastrophe engulfs and breaks open the social order in front of them, especially when the catastrophe hits the population disproportionately? You can think of the COVID-19 pandemic that affected us all, right? There was enough opportunity also for us to notice and voice our opinions on social media because we were all locked down and we were like left with Facebook media. Literature and art was also produced. I will come to this bit in the end of the presentation. To go back to the question, what should writers do when they witness the social order collapsing before them? They can write, of course, so they will write. And if conventional forms and genres are available to them, if the medium of publication and print, the provision of it is still intact, and if there is the added provocation from opposition on politics, they will write about the collapse and address the event in such a way that people who can afford to read these writings and recognize the dire situation they are also witnessing daily and are partly immunized against it, are made to think about it, about their role in it, and be activated towards the writer's political vision, if not the writer's politics per se. This is where I would like us to notice that writers in Bengal, what writers in Bengal did in the devastating condition of the 1943 famine. I will give a quick reading of Bhattacharya's poetry to show what formal and stylistic changes he had to implement in order to register the tremendous current crisis that he was witnessing. I would argue here that often there is a charge leveled against these writers who write about their contemporary tragedies that their writing is not strong, tight, or ripe enough, that their readings are journalistic and sensational, that their literary forms are sketchy and episodic. All of these might be true, but these criticisms also reveal what we mean by literature and how we see it to be. These criticisms point out at our own presumptions and prejudices about what a good literature should look like. A catastrophe is a near complete disorder of society and social rules. Good literature that reflects upon society afford to follow all the conventions built in a time of relative calm. As literary theorists from Aristotle, and you would remember catastrophe as a theatrical device before denouement, right? In the fifth act, last scene mostly, where all characters and all strands of the play are merged and reveal what is going to come next. Revelation is absolutely crucial about catastrophe. So as literary theorists, from Aristotle to more recently, Eric Kasdale, Naomi Klein, Pablo Mukherjee, and others have shown a catastrophe is the moment of revealing the underlying conditions that rule a society, because these conditions are laid bare now. A literary work based on a catastrophe also does the same. It reveals the underlying conditions of literary conventions. And it also asks us to see how things can be mended, of course, and if there is a radical change needed, but also how we need to see literature differently. Because we are living, as Sriman also mentioned, exceptional times, and literature has to be produced under exceptional conditions, will be the literature of exception. When this could be done by novelists or prose writers, something that I've written about elsewhere, poetry we know generally, and you will agree with me probably broadly, it does not engage with the political and social crisis directly. People don't write about plots and themes in poetry. Then what forced poets in Bengal to consider the famine and write in a visceral language about the catastrophe, hence, I think, transforming its form and style to such an extent that modern poetry, I argue, becomes more localized and spatialized So let me get to these questions and points through a very quick discussion of form and politics in Portuguese Bengal and then to Sukanto's poetry. I'll come to that. We'll come to this. You would recall that the Second World War was preceded in India by the birth of the Progressive Writers Association. Shaped widely by Marxist cultural and political aspirations, the association during the war focused much on the method of writing, the Marxian dialectic between form and content, and the role of history in shaping literary mood. The noted communist poet Vishnu Dev, in an essay on Notes on Progressive Writing in Bengal, commented, and I quote Vishnu Dev, "Methods of writing do not contradict modes of consciousness or beliefs. Mayakovsky was a symbolist and a revolutionary. That was the only logical step forward. Our writers, therefore, prepared themselves as writers and keep away, which means the cultivation of an awareness of one's problems, not as self-sufficient protections of one's private world, but as part of the wider historical process of which one is a part, so that the process of life becomes an interrelated whole with infinite possibilities of growth." Unquote. This was published in Shruti Pradhan's volume, The Marxist Cultural Movement in India, volume 1. While the war and rising cultural interest in communism had offered a concrete context for such classic Marxist discussion on form and content, the 1943 famine, and I will not go into the historical reasons or the conditions under which the famine broke out, because that's for another paper here. The 1943 Bengal famine, more than the war, made the imperialist degradation of indigenous life strikingly palpable. I will also not go into any detailing of the famine and not show any picture or any photos or images relating to the famine, because sometimes my understanding is that images affect us so much that we probably get lost sometimes in the images themselves. This paper is not about images. This paper is more about the poetry of it, the environment, the words of it. Thousands of Bengali people were out on the street begging for rice water, fighting dogs and fellow humans for food from the garbage, falling victim to diseases and dying on the street. Women and children were being sold away for food, while a large section of society was rejoicing the wealth accumulated from the war. This was an emergency never seen before. What became of art in the time of such a crisis? Did art even matter? And if it did, what would be the way to stage a play, say, to write a poem of violence but also of hope? Vijay Bhattacharya, founder of the Indian People's Theatre Association and writer of the first popular and critically successful famine play, Navarno, or New Harvest, in 1944, expressed his concerns in an interview. And I quote, "I saw the people dying like cats and dogs in the streets of Calcutta, muttering, fumbling. Could I reach my ears close to them? This was my only thought. I would go to many places and sit thinking what to write, what to do, how to do, just to gauge the depth of their suffering. While going on like this, I thought, if I wrote a drama and actually produced it, would it be worthwhile?" Unquote. This anxiety, along with the obligations to represent the crisis, something that Pritiman also mentioned, the obligation that we have to represent, the commitment, the question of responsibility, the inspiration from Marxist cultural organizations such as IPTA or PWA, and international literary examples available in Calcutta, be it Gour or others, made famine a presence in every form of art, from theatre to novels, from poetry to painting, from songs and choreography to film, from periodicals to lithography and others. So my argument in this paper is that poetry becomes shorter and more embodied and imagistic in the wake of the famine. So let me give you a close reading of Sukanto's poetry to establish the point, and then conclude with some observations on our own catastrophe that I think is the COVID-19 pandemic. Sukanto Bhattacharya, 1926 to 1957, lived briefly in a world ravaged by war, riot, violence, and hunger. a dedicated Communist Party member and restless worker in the days of famine and bombings, Sukanto was aware of the historical reasons of colonial subjection and Britain's imperialist fleet responsible for the catastrophe. It is extraordinary sometimes I think, because I have been working on these poems for some time, that how somebody who just lived 21 years could be so insightful and incisive in his letters, comments, and poems. And sometimes I feel like 21 years, right? And writing poems that we're thinking. And sometimes we have been taught these poems in schools, and we probably, as I said, partly immunized against them. We don't think of these poems any longer. But if you take time, pause, and read these poems slowly, you will know what he was going through. You will see the time from his choice of imagery that I'm going to be talking about. There is often a syllogistic structure in his poetry, syllogistic, logical. For instance, the long poem Vibriti or The Statement uses a logical structure of what imperialism means for famines, what people need to do against such a political-economic injunction, and what will such a struggle might achieve, of which I have written elsewhere. In later poems such as Rabindranath's Proti or To Rabindranath, the same structure is evident, but this time it is interspersed with more minute reflections of everyday life. Poetry becomes philosophical and embodied with observations of everyday condition of starvation and death around. For instance, consider this line. Yet there is no escape from starvation. I'm using a translation here, of course. And I don't like breaking the poem in between, so sorry for that. And yet there is no escape from starvation, and my mind is full of sighs because of that. I'm a poet of famine days. I see nightmares every day. The clear images of death. My springtime is spent in the long queues for food, and the blurt of siren alerts my sleepless night. My thrill does not die, even when there is a cruel bloodshed. I'm agog with surprise, even when my hands bound in chains. Not the best of translations, but I'll go with this one now. So if you see the references here, nightmares every day, springtime, full of signs, no escape from starvation, indicate the diurnal and seasonal embodiment by the poet of the material conditions of reality. My springtime refers to the poet's teenage days, but his world is full of the images of harsh reality and struggle for food. The blurt of siren alludes to the Japanese bombings of Calcutta during the Second World War and the blackout in the city. The hands bound in chains is a clear reference to colonialism and human bondage. These references situate the specific historical nature of the poem and the human responses to the consequences of the turbulent age. In order to make the responses effective, the poet uses the strategy of embodiment, where historical material realities are shown to be taking place in the poet's life cycle or in his body itself. He asserts that he is a poet of the times of famine, and unlike Rabindranath Tagore, who could still sing songs of love and peace amidst a crisis, he finds no such inspiration from this world he lives in. His world abounds in images of sorrow, pain, and despair, but he soon realizes that despair should not demotivate a poet. That was another stanza that I will quote here. The final stanza. And see, when I say that he soon realizes, this is again the logical structure. This is what is happening right now, and this is what we need to do. There is an urgent need more than ever for consolidated action and the revolutionary overthrow of the establishment. Poets, he says in the next stanza, have to come down from their ivory towers to the street and take part in the people's struggle against colonialism, which produces famine and starvation in the first instance, and they should inspire future generations' growth through their direct action and through their creative imagination of an egalitarian dawn. I can go into that because I wanted to give another example here. An example you would know already, I'm sure. Perhaps his most famous 8-line poem, and I mean 8-line. And I wanted to also suggest that there is a logical structure being developed in the poem. Why? Where does the logical structure come from? Is the logical structure actually forced by the contemporary realities of the famine that yes, we are going through a hard time, but we have to come back? How many times did we see something like that for the doctors and the nurses and the care workers and the bin pickers every day during the COVID-19 pandemic? We have to come back. So perhaps his most famous 8-line poem, right? Who writes 8-line poems, right? Something new. Hey Mahajibon or Oh Great Life advocates, I think, Shukanto's lifelong faith in and advocacy for catastrophe-based art. Oh great life, no more poetry again. Let me instead invoke art and sturdy prose. Let the soft lilting of words and their jingling be gone. Let the steep hammer of prose strike close. There is no need of the softness of poetry. I gradually live today poetry in my muse. In the land of hunger, prose is everywhere. The full moon hangs like a piece of fire-baked bread. An extraordinary imagination. And the final sequence at least. The poem raises the complaint that poetry cannot understand the prosaic, harsh reality of current life. But what kind of poetry is this? And he specifies that this is the kind of poetry that involves the lilting of words and their jingling, and a certain softness, indicating at the lyrical and subjectivist turn in the modernist poetry in Bengal, and pointing to his world as the land of hunger. Shukanto asserts that this form of poetry cannot speak adequately to the current socio-economic and historical crisis. Right or wrong, I don't know. As a literary scholar, we might say. But this is exactly what Shukanto thought at that moment when he wrote to his aunt in a number of letters about that. The poets are not ready or they are not speaking directly of the situation. Sometimes it might be said that Shukanto was restless, impatient. Shukanto was trying to build a society, probably rushing through it quite quickly, briskly, but at the same time, you would also think that Shukanto was 14 or 15 when the World War began. He died in 1947, right? Shukanto was 21. So, where does the wisdom of patience come from? Thank you. There is both an assertion here. So if you see the steep hammer of prose, strike prose. There is both assertion here for hard prose and a reference to the hammer in quote, the thudding of which brings orders to chaos and crisis. This juridical concept is emphasized in the following line where the poet grants leave to poetry, his inspiration. The final image, which is logically built again as a conclusion from the crisis in the world and the need for a strong prose in poetry, is one of the most memorable ones in modern Bengali poetry. The moon is compared with fire-baked bread. This is striking and modern because the moon in the post-Rabindranath romantic tradition of Bengali poetry has dominantly been related with inspiration, love, feminine beauty, and atmospheric charm. Shukanto not only challenges such imagination but establishes the prosaic, unimaginative, and raspy dimension of contemporary reality in relation to the moon. Through this image, Shukanto once again projects the embodied aspect of his poetic imagination. The moon, a non-living object, is imagined by hungry people as a provider of food and livelihood. Also, in a perverse way, I think, Shukanto qualifies that he does not mean poetry and poetic imagination to die. The brilliance of the image of the moon is an attestation to poetry's long life here. But he wants a certain kind of poetry, lyrical, subjective, and detached from social reality to disappear in the face of the current urgency. His poetry, through the striking and modernist images, through his innovative logical structuring, and his use of bare diction and direct references, announces a newness in poetic form that is intimately associated with the catastrophic consciousness of the current times. A lot of the writers and important major figures such as Buddhadev Gour thought Shukanto was wasting his time by writing political poetry. Now, this is something again after the debate. How does one write? Devendra Mitra also wrote poetry. Dinesh Das also wrote poetry of the famine, Jivanananda also used a lot of references of the family in his poetry. Suganta wrote also as well. Jivanananda and Premendra are given higher, maybe qualities in literary criticism. Suganta, yes, politically motivated. But I think we don't ask the question often, why do they write? How they write? So, realistic modernist is something else. Bengali poetry, I believe, changed in the catastrophic conjunctions of the 1940s, which Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and Tomika Sarkar have called the stormy decade. Indeed, starvation and food crisis did not end with the official end of colonialism. India's independence was marked by peasant movements led by the Communist Party's Kishan Sabha in Bengal, Punjab, and Telangana. Food crisis and food movement manifested in the streets of Calcutta, culminating in the food riots of 1964. And I'm just to read a few closing. Consider what Virendra Chakrabarty, known for his politically mediated poetry, composes in this poem. The astonishing smell of rice in the night sky. It seems that some still cook rice, still serve it, still eat it. And we are awake all night with the astonishing smell of rice in supplication all night. Taken a translation from Professor Supriya Choudhury, who kindly shared it on Facebook, and I took the opportunity and read it. So this is Virendra writing in 1960s and early 1970s. So I don't have the time to engage with the stylistic elements of the poem, but suffice it to say that poetry, at least a certain kind of poetry, political, observational, and committed to a cause, has evidently become shorter, more condensed and imagistic, like in Sukanta before. It is as if the octet of Sukanta's 8 lines was now talking 20 years later to the sestet of Virendra's poetry, as if completing the poetry of food crisis. The everyday means of survival, rice, water, smell, eating, and struggle for food has now entered the vocabulary of contemporary poetry, harking back to, as well as building a continuum with the historical memory of the famine and the contemporary post-colonial condition of poverty and food crisis. Taslima Nasreen insightfully captures this trident form of poetry in her introduction to the edited volume of famine poetry Tandao, or Give Me Some Rice Water, written on the 50th anniversary of the 1943 Bengal famine. Nasreen writes about how her father had gone through the ordeals of famine in 43, which came back to haunt them in 1974 in a newly independent Bangladesh, as a 12-year-old Taslima encountered starved and emaciated people begging for rice water and dying in the neighborhood, and heard stories from her parents of the Great Famine 3 decades back. She thus cynically asked about her edicts in the introduction. Of course, I had to indulge in changing the names of some poets, such as taking off a Shri before a name or an honorific, such as the PA, MA, after names. In truth, a famine is a very harsh thing. These ornaments do not offer justice to the tragedy. Indeed, they feel like ordening a skeleton's body with fancy jewelry. The harshness of content and form about political poetry that we discussed in the beginning of the paper cannot escape the mind of an editor compiling famine works even 5 decades after the event. The question of responsive and responsibility does not end, and I come to my final paragraph. It is precisely why a Shakespeare or a Tolstoy or a Davy goes back to a catastrophic moment in history and fabricates a narrative to remind us that we are in many ways still living comparable conditions. That a catastrophe has now effectively turned into a long-term socio-ecological crisis, and hence we should learn from these events. Literature in these instances does the job that is unique to the discipline itself. It imaginatively and functionally prepares us for the worst. I mentioned that I would conclude this presentation with the literatures of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last few years, we had to witness such which could be called our moment of the catastrophe. We saw our friends, relatives, and family helplessly dying, and we prayed that we survived the disaster. We couldn't do anything. There was not much that we could. We were fighting the enemy, an enemy that we could barely see. Like the famine, we did not know how we arrived here. We knew there was the virus, but we did not know what else to do other than doing the basics. But I say, we know. When I say we know, I mean people who can afford to know and do the basics, such as isolation and work from home. But how about those who couldn't? We saw them losing jobs, and asked to go back home. They walked thousands of miles, died on the streets and railway tracks, and finally, when they reached home, often they were not made welcome. You will also remember that this event was widely registered on social media, including contributions from celebrities to help them go back home. People voiced their emotionally laden comments on social media. We were angry. Noted poets and lyricists such as Gour penned a heart-rending poem. Film star Taapsee Pannu wrote a graphic poem. There were many who wrote Twitter poems. There were many short stories and poems. Indeed, people went back to the writings of Mira, if you remember his memoir, Life Misspent, to know of what he felt about the influenza pandemic, which killed millions almost 100 years ago in his own time. There will be people today who will write about the tragedies of our pandemic in every country, including the oxygen tobacco and the national tragedy thereafter that we saw in India. But in no way are the ones currently written, be it by Gour or Taapsee Pannu, to register the condition. In no way are they stylistically weaker or less effective, I think. Literature of the catastrophe which collapses the general social order cannot be measured by the conventions we measure literature otherwise with. It is an exceptional moment in history, and this literature, as I argued in the beginning, will have to be exceptional and different. When the catastrophe reaches a period of crisis within a recognized social order, literary forms may emulate recognizable styles and treatments. But there will be challenges, there will be additions that we haven't seen before, such as the logical structuring of poetry in Sukanta or a six-line poem by Gour. So let me conclude with the talk with a quotation from the French philosopher and novelist Maurice Blanchot, who wrote The Writing of the Disaster, which he wrote as a response to the Holocaust, a contemporary of the famine. And he writes, the disaster is related to forgetfulness. Forgetfulness about memory, forgetfulness without memory, the motionless retreat of what has not been treated, the immemorial perhaps, to remember forgetfully, again, the outside. Unquote. For Blanchot, the disaster as an event cannot be experienced in its fullness, and hence cannot be recognized for memory. If the disaster means being separated from the star, this star, Blanchot writes, then it is not our affair and has no regard for us. It cannot be measured by the simple laws of success and failure. I would like to echo Blanchot here in saying that a disaster ruins the basic principles through which society and cognition work, and hence this literature has to be something that we have not experienced before. Simple laws and structural failure is not the concern of the reader of this literature here, but rather the purity of failure in the response and the responsiveness. With this, I stop my presentation. Thank you.